everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Today is February 15th, which is National Gumdrop Day. So after this wonderful webinar, go ahead and build a beautiful gingerbread house and decorate all types of gumdrops and celebrate today. As always, I'm delighted to be able to speak with all of you today. Kroll, we're always looking to provide thoughtful insight, great value to our clients, and help them defend their organization against the latest cyber threats to improve their cyber maturity. My name is Keith Wojciech. I'm a Managing Director and Global Head of Threat Intelligence for Kroll, and I'm based in the Washington, D.C. area. I've been with Kroll for almost 6 years now, and prior to this, I worked for the U.S. Secret Service, where I was able to have the opportunity to lead the Secret Service Cyber Threat Intelligence Program. But before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. I want to let you know today's session will be recorded and will be available after the briefing. We are using GoToWebinar for the presentation, and you'll find the client on your monitor. Through that client, you'll be able to submit questions at any time, and either George and or Lori will address the questions at the end. So Kroll has carried out about 30,000 engagements in 2022. Today, we'll be taking a look at current trends that our threat intelligence team has seen. We'll be addressing the Q4 data and highlighting key takeaways from 2022. Kroll is in a unique position to deliver end-to-end cybersecurity solutions across several different service lines. We have a wealth of experience with over 650 cybersecurity experts and working around the globe with different companies, many sizes, different varieties of industry, and work with over 60 cyber insurance carriers. This really gives us tremendous visibility into what's going on in the front lines. In this session, we'll be covering the cyber threat landscape with a focus on Q4. Kroll has seen a peak in ransomware incidents, an evolution of phishing attacks, the abuse of OneNote and of Google Ads for initial access. We'll also go through a couple case studies to show the impact of these types of attacks. We're very fortunate, and I'm really excited to have two leading experts join us today from Kroll. We're joined by Lori Iacono and George Glass. Lori is Associate Managing Director in Kroll Cyber Risk. Lori is the Strategic Operations Leader and manages the day-to-day functions for the Cyber Threat Intelligence team, including the support of active incident response engagements. Prior to Kroll, Lori managed the Brand and Consumer Protection Program at the National Cyber Forensics Training Alliance, or the NCFTA, which is headquartered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. George Glass is the Intelligence Operations Leader at Kroll and is responsible for ensuring that the latest threat actor intelligence is applied to our proprietary XDR platform used to power the managed detection and response service to our clients around the globe. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lori to give us more insight into the cyber threat landscape for 2022. Lori?
Thanks, Keith, for that introduction. So for those of you who might be joining our quarterly threat landscape for the first time, I do want to give a little bit of background on our methodology here. So what we will be covering this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're at, we will be looking at the what we saw in our incident response cases. So this is events where there was some kind of a cyber incident that led to them engaging with Kroll. We will also be, once we look at that data that we're seeing from our incident response practice, which is the basis for a lot of the graphs you'll be seeing throughout the presentation and a lot of the statistics, we overlay that with trends that we're seeing on the dark web, such as, chatter or exposure by threat actors in certain underground forums. And then we're also comparing that with what we're seeing in open source literature about security topics within the quarter and the last year. And then George's team specifically, as Keith mentioned, is kind of looking at all of this from the detection side. So how can we detect this activity before it leads to an incident response engagement? So in our first section here, we're going to look specifically at some analysis of sectors that we saw not just in Q4 but also throughout the year in 2022. So looking, this slide here is showing basically a comparison from what we observed in 2021 to what we observed in 2022. So you can see, and this also I want to mention, this analysis here, this is looking at all threat incident types that we see. So it's not honing in on just one, it's looking across all threat incident types that we see in IR practice. As you can see, for us, professional services was the top impacted sector that we were seeing in our cases. We continue to see that particular sector being targeted. Particularly of that, we see a lot of legal and law firms being targeted within the professional services sector. Typically, the top incident type that we see with that sector is email compromise, and phishing is usually the likely initial access method for that sector. With financial services, you can see here that was mostly static year over year. Mostly within that financial services category, a lot of the entities that we're looking at are small to mid-sized wealth management firms or small banks or credit unions. We don't see a lot of malware or ransomware in our investigations related to the financial services sector. We tend to see more email compromise or unauthorized access, particularly insider threats with that particular sector. Now, where we did see some year-over-year increases from 21 to 22 were in 3 particular sectors: healthcare, manufacturing, and technology and telecom. And if we move over to the next slide here, we can kind of see, that all 3 of those sectors tend to be favorites of targeting of the ransomware groups, particularly manufacturing and healthcare. So we have definitely seen those groups targeting the healthcare manufacturing sectors. We talked a lot about that in the Q2 threat landscape, and today we're going to dive a little bit deeper into what we're observing related to manufacturing and the technology sector. So this was looking at 2022. If we drill into the next slide here, looking specifically at what we were seeing in Q4. So this is kind of changed from Q3 of 2022 to Q4 of 22. Again, you see these 3 sectors had some of the biggest increases that we observed quarter over quarter, particularly that technology sector. So we will be talking about some examples, particularly one case study impacting a managed service provider later on in the presentation. So first I want to get into, on the next slide, we do have a case study here talking specifically about manufacturing. And we have seen within the last year that manufacturing has been an attractive target to threat actors. So the question is, why is manufacturing a favorite of threat actors? There are a few reasons for that. One is probably likely, kind of post-pandemic, there have been a lot of speculation, due to the weak supply chain. This may be why threat actors are trying to take advantage of those already weakened state of the supply chain and trying to make it even worse. They also may have a belief that this sector is softer when it comes to security and detection. As we mentioned, we see less malware and ransomware targeting the financial services sector. Typically, the financial services sector is very well known for having very robust defenses against these kind of attacks. So there may be a belief amongst threat actors that manufacturing is a softer target. Also, we see with manufacturing, if critical functions stop, like a production line, there's a real dollar amount there that's on the line for that organization then. If production is halted, they're no longer able to make that product or good, and they're losing money basically every minute that is stopped. So this case study here is a good example of that happening to an organization. So this was actually a case related to Vice Society ransomware. So the actors got into the system through a botnet infection. And once they were in the system, they basically began exploring the network. They were maintaining persistence with a variety of remote access tools, which is something we see very commonly across ransomware cases. And as I said, as they were exploring the system, they eventually got access to a domain admin account, so they were able to level up their privileges within the system. From there, they exfiltrated hundreds of gigabytes worth of data. And before they hit or deployed their payload, they actually locked all of the IT staff out of their account. So they changed those passwords. So once the network was encrypted, the IT staff had difficulty even getting back into the network. And once they did inflict this deployment of ransomware. Unfortunately, at this time, the critical operating systems of that organization were halted. So it just kind of highlights, as I said, the risk that attacks like this pose to the manufacturing sector. So George, I'd kind of like to talk or have you maybe talk a little bit here about how or what insights detection is seeing, trying to like identify this kind of activity before it leads to this halting of operations.
Sure, thank you, Laurie. I think you're absolutely right in saying that manufacturing is seen as a soft target. Oftentimes, OT or ICS technology, maybe it needs to be run on older versions of operating systems. There simply isn't software that can run on newer operating systems, and that quite often makes it very hard to deploy like an endpoint detect and response tool to those systems, and it's harder to maintain good visibility over the entire network. In this particular instance, obviously the initial infection vector was an endpoint that could have had EDR tooling deployed on it, and then in that particular case, you're catching the threat actor right at the beginning of the kill chain. But in other areas, it's as I said, it's often hard to put those EDR tools onto endpoints, and in those cases, you need to resort more to SIEM technology to collect logs from those machines to identify any lateral movement. Network detection tools to try and catch the exfiltration of that large amount of data. But of course, catching that exfiltration of data typically comes at the very end of a ransomware attacker's lifecycle. That's the last thing they do before deploying the ransomware, and in this particular case, locking staff out of the systems as well. So in all aspects of any kind of cyber defense, we're trying to push those detections to the beginning of the kill chain wherever possible to give us the earliest opportunity to detect any sort of cyber threat in a particular network. And with that, I'll hand back over to you.
Thanks. So we're going to move on into the next section here. We're going to talk a little bit about the threat types that we were seeing in 2022 and also in Q4. So the first slide here, we're looking again at year over year. The first thing that probably jumps out to people on this graph is that drop we have there with email compromise from 2021 to 2022. So a lot of that activity in 2021 around email compromise was related to the activity that we were seeing at Kroll from Exchange proxy logon cases. That was a pretty large scale cyber event. It started with, kind of a nation state attack leveraging those vulnerabilities. And then, threat actors, once that was published, is taking advantage of those vulnerabilities. So we did see a lot of activity around email compromise in 2021. And in 2022, it kind of returned to the more normal levels that we see from that particular threat. Now with ransomware, total percentages were somewhat static year over year, so we didn't see a lot of change from 2021 to 2022 in percentage of cases. But if we look at kind of like our total number of ransomware incidents, we did see a drop off in ransomware activity overall in 2022. Likely that kind of decline or ebb in activity was due to the kind of geopolitical shifts that were happening around the Ukraine and Russia conflict, as many threat actors may have been kind of repurposed from ransomware to more cyber or state-directed cyber attacks or things like that. We also probably saw that playing into the uptick we were seeing in web compromise. Most of those cases are related to credit card skimmers that are trying to steal payment card information. And certainly in the dark web, since the Russia and Ukraine conflict has began, we've been seeing more and more payment card activity or stolen credit cards being offered for sale on the dark web. So that's kind of, as I said, what we were seeing year over year when it came to threat incident types. And then if we move over to the next slide here, we're going to talk a little bit more in depth specifically about what we were seeing related to ransomware. So looking at 2022, breaking it down by quarter. As I said, we were kind of seeing less overall numbers of ransomware, but we started to see a lot of ransomware activity really peaking up, and we continue to see that now going into 2023. We particularly started seeing a lot of that activity in like mid Q4, really start ramping up. Likely that drop in Q3 may be related to the disbanding of the Conti ransomware operation, which disbanded kind of like the end of Q2. As it is with most of these groups, they likely don't completely shut down or go away, but they're likely rebranding as some other ransomware group and coming back. So we might have seen a slight ebb there in Q3 due to that kind of, shifting. And then, another reason why we may be seeing more ransomware attacks now is you may be following along. There was some reporting by some entities recently talking about, overall ransomware profits were down in 2022, I think by like some, I want to say like by $400 million or something like that. So it could be that now those entities are seeing how far profits were down, and now they're being a little more aggressive and with the frequency and tenor of their attacks, trying to recoup some of that money. On the next slide, we're going to look specifically at some of the variants that we were seeing being the most active in 2022. Pretty much by a long shot, Lockbit is the most active group that we were seeing in 2022. We continue, again, like I said, to see that group being very active in the first quarter of 2023. We also saw a lot of activity around Royal ransomware. And I do want to highlight that one because we didn't start observing Royal ransomware in our caseload until about November. And even though we only saw it for about 6 weeks in 2022, it ended up accounting for more than 6% of the total ransomware cases that we had. So you can kind of judge by that the frequency that we were seeing it in a very short amount of time. And you can see there that Hive was also active in 2022. Again, this is a group that has since been shut down and dismantled by law enforcement. AvoSlocker, we saw a lot of activity there with AvoSlocker. We did a really nice report on the Kroll website about some tactics and techniques that AvoSlocker was using to exploit some vulnerabilities in backup software to help them hide their exfiltration on systems. And they were also kind of deleting backups as a standard or part of their attacks. So we should be putting some of those into the chat so that you can refer to these articles later. We also did some case studies on Black Foster ransomware. One of the things that's been very notable about that group in the last year is their collaboration with botnets, specifically Qbot, as a means to gain footholds into system and kind of amplify their attacks. So George, as we look at this slide here, we kind of tend to see the names changing quite a lot of the ransomware groups, but how much does that variant name type really matter when it comes to detection?
Thanks, Laurie. Yeah, when it comes to ransomware groups and differentiating the groups from each other, of course, it's very interesting to try and bucket TTPs to specific groups. But I think what we find is really the main thing we want to identify is when we get a detection, is this potentially a precursor to ransomware? So is this in the bundle of detections that we typically see in a ransomware style event? Are they escalating privileges in a similar sort of way? Are they moving laterally? Are they trying to access backup servers, so on and so forth? The main thing there is to try and differentiate a ransomware attack from an info stealer campaign or some sort of cyber espionage. Really, the names of the group make very little difference to how we detect these sorts of threats. The main thing we want to do is be able to detect and respond to them quickly and understand what sort of attack we're dealing with when we're analyzing those detections. So I'd say that's the main difference, and that the name probably doesn't matter so much when we're building these sorts of things.
Thanks. And you know, I'll add to that too that, you know, we see these kind of larger groups, but in the past year there's also been a lot of exposure of different ransomware groups. So we've had Conti leaks, the Lockbit builder was leaked, Babic ransomware source code was leaked on a forum. And what we are also seeing, I know we've certainly seen some of this in the first quarter of this year, is we're seeing a lot of actors kind of taking advantage now of all that material that's kind of out there open source, and maybe actors who are less sophisticated cobbling some of that together to conduct some attacks like this. So going into the next section of the webinar, we're going to talk specifically about initial access. So how are actors getting into systems? So this is looking, as I said, year over year. We saw a really, you know, a lot of the cases that we were seeing in 2022 were starting, you know, phishing was kind of the nexus for getting a foothold into the system. And as I said, we had, you know, with some of the groups like Black Bossa, they were using, you know, infections like Qbot to gain a foothold into systems. That does account for some of that activity. George is also going to talk kind of about the evolution that we've seen in phishing over the past year. A lot of the drop there from, you know, in 2021, we were reporting a lot more related to CVE. And as I mentioned earlier, we saw a lot of activity in 2021 related to Exchange proxy logon. So a lot of that was coded as CVE, so that accounted for a large majority of work that we did in 2021, and we're seeing less of that. CVE is still a very common way for threat actors to get into systems. In fact, if we drill down into just ransomware cases, those bottom three, CVE, external remote services, and valid accounts, those are really the top three ways that we see actors leveraging. Right now, there's a really good example of actors leveraging older CVEs to get into systems. This is the ESXi ARGS ransomware campaign that's been, you know, much discussed in the last 2 to 3 weeks because this is a very active campaign. And those actors are all leveraging some vulnerabilities that were published about 2 years ago now. So these are older vulnerabilities, but they have found, unfortunately, many organizations are still running on those older versions. When it comes to you know, valid accounts, those are essentially, you know, actors using maybe publicly available information such as usernames or passwords that are dropped somewhere on the dark web, and they're leveraging that to get into systems. So at the end of the day, you know, a lot of the attackers that we see are very opportunistic. They're taking advantage of what is out there about your organizations, and they're using that, unfortunately, to get back into the system. So as I said, we did see throughout the past year, we saw a lot of evolution when it came to phishing. And I'm going to turn it over to George now, and he's going to talk a little bit about that evolution of phishing. We've also seen some new initial access methods that aren't necessarily captured on the chart there related to Google ad abuse, which is kind of a new thing we started seeing in the latter half of the year. So George is going to speak to that as well.
Thank you very much, Laurie. Yes, 2022 was a pretty significant shift in the threat landscape for phishing, and pretty much this entire landscape shift began when Microsoft announced that they would be dealing with the mark of the web differently. And the mark of the web is a identifier applied to a file that means that when a Microsoft Office program processes that file, it is dealt with in different ways depending on where it's come from. Now, the changes that they said they would make is that a user would have to make more of a conscious effort to enable macros if that file had been downloaded from the internet. Now, I'm sure many cyber defenders are familiar with Office documents with malicious macros enabled on them, whether it be docx or Excel files, all of them containing malicious macro to go and download malware, install it and run it. And there's many different ways of achieving that, but they all stemmed from delivering a Office document with some sort of social engineering lure built into it to cause the user to click enable editing and click enable macros and install the malware. And that's what we were seeing for years prior. Doesn't matter, you know, if it's a Word document or an Excel document, that's the majority of the phishing that we were seeing that led to a malware download. But once this change was announced, many threat actors quickly moved and pivoted to other methods of delivering malware to victim endpoints. And some of these changes actually mean sort of going back to the old tried and trusted method of using LNK or shortcut files. In April of 2022, we saw Emotet begin to experiment with .lnk attachments. Just an LNK attachment in an email, could be zipped, may not be. And they saw limited success using these styles. I think email defense products were pretty quick to adapt to this, and I think they saw their success rate waning somewhat. The next evolution of this, therefore, was to try and obfuscate those tactics even more, to try and defeat the inline email defense products, and indeed even EDR and antivirus products on the endpoint itself. And what actors began to do was to use ISO file containers. And these ISO containers would contain the malicious LNK to avoid detection with the antivirus scanning. So most antivirus products probably won't mount an ISO file. And indeed, those LNKs would use some sort of DLL sideloading. DLL standing for Dynamic Linked Library. And we saw Quackbot using this sort of around June, July time. And this particular campaign consisted of an ISO file that was attached to an email. The user would open and mount that ISO file, and LNK would be engineered in such a way to say invoice or a pro forma or something along those lines, just enticing that user to click on that LNK. That shortcut file would actually open calc.exe, the calculator application, but the DLL that was included in that ISO container was actually malicious. And DLL sideloading relies on the way that Microsoft uses search ordering in the file system. And in that particular case, it meant that the calc.exe process would load that malicious DLL. So the user would see calculator pop up. Sure, that's a bit weird, but maybe nothing to alert the cybersecurity team about. But in actual fact, that malicious DLL was actually downloading and installing malware onto that particular system. And this became the tried and tested tactic for quite some months. We did see some other experimentation as well. The use of open documents, which is like an open source and free version of the Microsoft Office suite. In those particular cases, it would download a .doc anyway, with a malicious Excel workbook included in that, which then harked back to using the old tried and trusted Office macros. This particular method bypassed the mark of the web being placed onto those Excel worksheets. So again, that was working for a time, but again, the security industry is pretty quick to adapt to these things. Interestingly, in the run up to Christmas and certainly afterwards, we're seeing a big rise in the use of OneNote documents. And OneNote is particularly interesting because it didn't apply the same changes that Microsoft did for the rest of the Office suite. So it doesn't apply the mark of the web. It doesn't deal with that in the same way. It doesn't have an enable macros option. And what we're seeing here is the social engineering lure, which harkens back to Emotet, IcedID, Quackbot installers that used document files, but in this case, it's just a OneNote. And all of these social engineering lures are just relying on one thing, and that is someone trying to do their job. They're trying to open that invoice. And as you can see here, that very enticing double click to view file, if we just move that out the way, we can see what the user is really clicking on. It's just a copy and pasted script underneath that. That's not really a button, it's just an image. So what the user is actually doing is initiating that script themselves without even knowing it. And that document there will contain some malicious JavaScript, which will eventually lead to the installation of malware. Really simple, but very, very effective. And I think if we go to the next slide here, we can see, it's again, there's really no difference from way back when using a macro usually the actions on target are very similar. So we have a command prompt process starting a PowerShell process, which downloads a decoy OneNote document, which the user is presented with. They think they've opened the file properly this time, but in actual fact, there's a malicious backed file downloaded with that and executed, installing the malware. So this change is again indicative of how quickly the cyber threat actors are to change in the landscape, and it's the job of the cybersecurity industry to keep ahead of this and make sure that detections are in place for these particular types of attack. Putting email to one side for a while, let's have a look at Google ad abuse. In November, we discovered that there were a number of malicious Google ads being placed, which were masquerading as legitimate software. In this particular case here, we saw a Google ad placed for GIMP, which is a open source photo editing tool. And one thing that I want to make really clear is this is more than just SEO poisoning. It's more than just putting a blog to the top of the Google ads, or Google search suggested, using SEO techniques to entice people to click. As you can see from the image here, as far as any user is concerned, the link that they are about to click will go to gimp.org, but that is not the case. What they're presented with is a typo squatted domain. It looks a little bit like gimp.org, and underneath is a perfect clone of the website. However, if they went to the download section and downloaded the tool, what they would find in this particular case is the VIDAR information stealer would be downloaded and installed. And since November, we released a blog on how we believe this particular technique is used, and how frankly simple it is to pull off. And one of the really useful things from a threat actor perspective of using Google Ads in this way is it's got built-in targeting. You can target a user by their operating system, the country that they're connecting from, some of the things that Google think they may be interested in. And in this way, you can target specific groups of people in specific organizations in specific countries, which is really very powerful. Without having to do reconnaissance or anything like that, you can get those initial access malwares installed and sell that access on to, let's say, ransomware groups. So I think if we go to the next slide here, one of the examples that we're going to cover is a case study on a managed service provider. And in this particular case, the Google ad was for a piece of IT management software that the user thought that they were downloading a legitimate version of, but indeed, in this particular case, it was Batloader. And I'm going to pass back over to Laurie to take us through the rest of this case study. Over to you.
Thanks, George. So yeah, so as George mentioned, this one started with someone, going out there and basically finding a, Google ad for common IT management software that they thought they were downloading, and actually it was, downloading, delivering Batloader to their system, and then, from there, credentials are stolen, and they were able to have access into the system. It's interesting with most of these Google ads that we've observed, they have been related to something IT related. So it's very likely that they're trying to use this kind of tactic to get those domain admin credentials, right? Because that's kind of the, that's really like the gold standard for what the threat actors want to use to get back into a system. So if you have someone from IT going to one of those sites and potentially using domain admin credentials, that would be a good way to get them. It also, seems like they may be targeting specifically that sector. This is a means to, put up one site that may catch you multiple different victims, rather than, having to craft a certain campaign for each, victim down the line. So obviously, kind of casting a wider net here as well. In this specific instance, once they had access to the account, very similar to the first example, it's kind of like part of the playbook, so to speak, that then they're going to, you know, elevate privileges within the system. We see data exfiltration being very common with these actors. In this case, they were using rclone to do that. And then ultimately, Black Basta was deployed on the network. Now, in this particular case, this was, you know, an instance where they were able to identify this activity before it reached to their downstream customers. So only the entity was impacted. But you can see when they hit MSP like this, there is the possibility that this could also spread downstream and become a much larger attack. So if threat actors, again, if they are trying to, you know, ramp up profits and get those bigger attacks, these MSPs could be a very attractive target for them to do that. I think if we go into the next section here, we're almost at the wrap up, I think. So we'll talk a little bit about, you know, looking ahead into 2023 and you know, some of what we're already seeing and what we think we will be seeing. Next slide here. You know, as I said previously, you know, it just seems like we're seeing more and more of threat actors, you know, targeting technology, targeting those IT professionals, trying to get those admin credentials. It does seem like, you know, there is the possibility, if they're being more aggressive like this with initial access, that the attacks themselves could begin to become more destructive. We also continue to just see, you know, threat actors more and more circumventing defense tools that are put into place, unfortunately. And, you know, evolving in complexity and impact of what they're hitting us with. So, you know, ransomware and phishing tactics, as George described. I saw a question earlier, you know, talking about kind of like with ransomware, we're not just watching out for the ransomware operators. It's really, you know, kind of the affiliates and what they're doing. And we see in a lot of our cases, sometimes the affiliates, like, you know, Royal Ransomware is a good example. They're using multiple different initial access methods to get into systems. It's not just one. So you can't just say, okay, this is what to do to defend against Royal Ransomware, because they're using everyone at their disposal. A lot of these affiliates do seem to be working for multiple different groups. So we have seen sometimes in our investigations, they come in, they try to deploy one ransomware, antivirus picks that up and blocks it. So then they hit with another strain of ransomware. So we're definitely seeing that happen as well. And then I'll let George kind of speak to some of what we're seeing with artificial intelligence.
Thank you, Laurie. Yes, a lot has been made of the release of ChatGPT and some of the ways that can be used to facilitate cybercrime. I think there's definitely arguments to be made that is certainly one of the ways that it could be used. But also conversely, it could be used in a way that maybe it's not intended to. You know, any AI tool is really only as good as the data set that it's trained on. And if a developer were to use that tool to maybe ask it to write some code, the tool answers very authoritatively. You know, it makes it seem like it knows what it's doing, but it's just trying to guess the next word that should come next. The same is true for code, and vulnerabilities could be introduced into code using that tool as well. So it really does swing both ways. It's very, very useful, but again, it can be you know, misused in some ways as well. And I think the other thing that we're really seeing, as we've mentioned throughout the presentation today, is an increase in attacks against OT environments. And as I said before, it is very hard to deploy EDR across an entire OT estate and ICS technologies. And in that case, you know, falling back to using SIEM technology and network detection technology to catch threat actors as they traverse the network, may be some of the only ways that those can be actively defended. But again, we've got to remember that there are some very important takeaways on hygiene and so on and so forth. And with that, I will hand back to Laurie. Over to you, Laurie.
Okay, and I actually think I'm handing it over to Keith here, because he's going to talk a little bit about some actions organizations can take given all this information.
Yeah, thank you, Laurie, George. That was fantastic. So, you know, everyone, Laurie and George took you really through the rivers of the underworld, but there is a way out, right? There's a way to a little bit of sunshine here. And George actually hit it there. The top things we're looking for different areas or actions you can take. Top one, EDR, the endpoint detection response to all endpoints. Like George said, could be challenging to do, but it's so important and vital to thwart off some of these threat actors trying to get into your network, traverse laterally. And all it really is a lightweight agent deployed on their laptops, servers, workstations, and it provides visibility for all suspicious behavior, executables, binaries running that are unwanted, being able to isolate. It's extremely important to be on your network. Second one, we know we talk about this all the time, multi-factor authentication. Today, as we're looking at all of these engagements, we talked earlier about over 3,000 engagements, I would say a high percentage of those do not have MFA enabled across their network. There's different types of MFA, either authenticators using text message. I know it's not wanted, but anything is better than nothing. And then really trying to having that enabled for every system on your account. And finally, I would say access control. There's a whole list of 10 of them we have. I think these are the top 3. Institute a least privilege policy where you're looking at who really needs access to specific environments. It's very important to audit those, and if someone wants to leave, making sure you're getting rid of those and disabling them. The permissions are so important and vital for those threat actors to move laterally. And if you can limit the amount of people that have those access privileges, it'll really be able to maintain the integrity of your environment. So with that, we have a few questions, and so we have a few minutes now to take some of the questions. A quick reminder is to type your questions in for Lori and George. We had a couple come in during the session, so let's start with those. George, can you talk about malicious DLLs and how they are sideloaded?
Yeah, absolutely. So a DLL, a dynamic link library, is basically a portable executable in some way. It's a piece of code that is typically used by another program, imported into that program. It helps operate, whether it's interacting with certain Windows APIs, other programs, the network, what have you. It's something that can be imported. One of the vulnerabilities of the way that Microsoft loads DLLs in some of its applications is you can put a malicious DLL named in such a way that that application is expecting to see it in that place, and that application will dutifully see that name and not ask any questions about it, and import that potentially malicious piece of code, and that's called DLL sideloading or search order hijacking. And so in that way, if you were to craft a malicious DLL, as far as the user concerned, the application may run totally normally, but under the hood, there are malicious actions taking place. I hope that's a good answer.
I agree. Thank you, George. Really appreciate that. Lori, so I think this is really kind of geared towards you, looking at the trends from 2022, kind of a prediction as much as we can into 2023. What do you see being targeted? What industries? What's the future? Do you have the magic ball that you can tell people, hey, be on the lookout for?
Keith asked me this because he knows I don't like this question. Because I am not a fortune teller, but when we looked at the data from this year, we certainly saw the trend with healthcare, manufacturing, and technology. So we certainly believe that that trend will continue. Those are 3 very attractive sectors to certainly the ransomware groups. And really the unfortunate thing is no sector is safe, because even if it's kind of like you're more targeted by ransomware in certain sectors than you see, like with finance, there's insider threat, there's always some kind of cyber threat that it is unfortunately impacts every single sector.
Yeah, no, that is a good answer. And we got one last one. I think this is really key, and I'm just gonna take a stab at this myself, but I want Lori, George, I want you to add on this. What cyber threat worries you the most if it was your company? To me, if it was my company, the cyber threat would not be external, it would be more internal. I'd be worried that I'm not prepared enough to be aggressive towards these threat actors, knowing what they can do, or the not awareness of the seriousness of these criminals, not being prepared, is really something that I would be most detrimentally afraid of. George, Lori, do you have any comments? And if it was your company, what would you be worried about?
Yeah, sure. I'll go first if you don't mind, Laurie. I certainly agree. Insider threats very, very, very worrying. I think one of the things that would worry me is understanding my patching strategy, understanding the capability of actors sort of before they execute on some of these things. I think Laurie hit the nail on the head earlier with the ESXi ARGS ransomware, which is going on right now. I'm sure some of those organizations impacted didn't even have those ESXi versions on their bill of materials. As far as they're concerned, this has blindsided them, and it has come out of nowhere. And it's such a difficult thing to keep on top of. So I think that would be the top one for me.
Yeah, and I would probably say, and you know, I guess ransomware probably gives me the most heartburn just because I've seen like the devastation, like the impact of those attacks. I mean, really, the biggest thing though is not getting like really keeping actors out of your system, or if they get into your system, having a very quick way to contain them and to stop that damage from leveraging other parts of the network. Because a lot of times we will see actors get into maybe like a relatively flat network, and they're able to see quite a lot very quickly. They're able to get into a lot of email inboxes, and sometimes on the extortion side of things, that can get, I guess I would say, a little wild. Because of the information they can get to, because they can just see so much. So, you know, knowing that the actors are knocking on the door, they might even get in through the door, but having something that stops them before they get into another room is really important.
Yeah, that's both of you. That's really awesome. So we had some really good questions asked about AI, APTs, but unfortunately, we run out of time today. We will get to those. We will provide you with an answer based with our experts, and we'll email you the answer. So if anyone else has any questions, please keep submitting them, and we'll answer those for sure. But a big thank you to everyone that's taken the time to tune in. We hope you found the session informative. We have published our Q4 2022 report, threat landscape report, on Kroll.com. So if you want to go deeper into the trends we're outlined today, please look at the report. You can also find a copy of it in the handout section of the GoToWebinar. When you leave the briefing, you'll be directed to a short survey. If you could spare a few moments, we'd greatly appreciate if you could tell us the thoughts on the session. This helps us prepare for future sessions, what you find informative, the length, the context, everything. Anything you can give us feedback, we really appreciate it. We take that and we actually try to improve every session. So please take your time and fill out the survey. Once again, thanks for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to see you again in one of the future briefings. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.